In this lecture, I'm going to go over three main readings: Marbury versus Madison, Federalist Papers number 47, and the preamble to the United States Constitution. So what you need to think about in this is this idea of instrumentalities as a structural or a form of social relations. In other words, there's only so many strategies or choices that you have in any given situation with other people. Probably the easiest example to think about would be in your family and the role you play in that family as far as what your power position is. Obviously, an infant is completely powerless. However, in most families, the infant has a great amount of control over the daily activities of everyone else in the family. So you see that there's a negotiation going on, even though the power roles are very unclear. As the child gets older, you'll see children kind of push against this. And in many times they'll need absolute support, and then other situations they'll want their own autonomy or liberty. But just like folks in society, a child cannot get absolute liberty, right? If you're completely on your own in the middle of nowhere, first of all, you're likely to die. The second is you're not really free because you don't have the basic necessities, the basic structure around you in order to make choices. So you'd just be in a situation of survival, and that's not liberty. So you want to start with this idea that the Constitution itself is a negotiation among groups of people who comprise of individuals, right? But the individuals form a group, and you've got multiple groups competing with each other for power. So you have a cessation of hostilities or a brief pause in violence leading up to the American Revolution. And the three main groups in 1776, as they sit down to make this negotiation, are kind of what are called Republicans at that time, which they believe in small farming, and many of them were also educating themselves to become lawyers. At that time, a doctor was somebody who was more like a chemist today. And then, in other certain professions like education, printmaking, whereas the other group was largely plantation or slave traders in the South who were interested in acquiring large amounts of property and then cultivating that property and selling their goods to the North, to Europe, and to other, local populations. And then you had this kind of third group, which was kind of more based in what you could call kind of finance or merchants, right? People who are selling the products that are necessary to carry on your profession. So if you're a lawyer, it's books. If you're a printmaker, it's the printmaking materials, paper. And then if you're a plantation owner, then it's slaves, it's human beings. The merchants are selling human beings. And so as they kind of travel on their boats from place to place, they pick up different items that they're going to come back and sell at what we call the market, or the quote-unquote free market. And this is kind of always the difficulty. So the Constitution here, I highlighted these big words because we want to think about them. When they're thinking of the word order, they're not thinking about law and order. They're not thinking about law enforcement. What they're thinking about is the structure, putting down onto paper what are the power relations amongst the different groups. And their goal is to form a union so that these groups stop fighting with each other and they enter into a dialogue and negotiate with each other. And this is what they conceive of to be justice, is putting violence or self-interest behind the interest of the larger group. And then they believe this will create peace, which is called tranquility, and this will help them be better at providing for a common defense, both against, at this time, American Indian populations, French populations, Spanish populations, and possibly the British. And then also this idea of promoting welfare. In other words, like this, the reason we formed this government is to make sure that everyone has what they need in order to have liberty, to be able to make choices, to be able to secure what they call the blessings of liberty, which they call life, liberty, and property. The idea that you can kind of work with your family or work with other groups in order to feed yourself and your group, to protect yourself, and to otherwise, explore things that you're interested in, whether it be painting, whether it be having a garden, whether it be performing, right, in the performing arts, or whether you just want to sit at home and stare at the wall. First, before you can do any of those things, you need to have the basics that we all need to survive. And so this is their idea of forming this in a constitution so they can pass it down to future generations, and that's what posterity means. So a French philosopher in the 60s was asked a pretty interesting question, and the question is, assuming for a second that Karl Marx was correct and that at some point the powerless would organize, rise up, and overthrow the powerful, largely because this has happened so many times in the past, whether it was the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, or even just before, hundreds of years before that, when you have the Magna Carta, where you have the landowners or the managers, land managers, are pushing against the king. So you always have this kind of tension in history of folks who want power and those who are under that power. I'll give you two kind of examples from pop culture. Is one I watched John Wick 3 last night, and it's very clear in this. It's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The law is flexible. The law is more malleable, as we say in law school. In other words, as soon as he violates a rule, but a rule that he believes that he's just in violating, and he's willing to pay the price or pay the consequence for that. However, the rule maker, who is above the table, as they say, gives him a pardon and allows him to, basically as if that event never happened, as if he never broke the rule. So you kind of see that law is not a thing, right? Law is a concept that people share, and you can easily change your mind about what it means and who has to follow it and kind of what the rule even is. And because a number of people find that system to be unfair, leading up to the fourth one, I hate to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it, if you're ever going to see it, but they're now going to be going against the set of rules because they find the set of rules to be unfair, and they make their own rules. And their rules are interesting if you look at it from the perspective of they're making a social agreement based on this concept of your blood being your bond. So if I help you, then you owe it to help me. Very different than the rulemaking scheme that's occurring in number one. And there's an underlying rule in these films, which is you are not allowed to abuse dogs without there being severe consequences. And so that's kind of an interesting moral rule behind the story. The second example is an example I'm sharing with my 6-year-old niece, which is Yertle the Turtle, which if you have never read it, it's an easy enough thing to find on the internet. And it's interesting to read because it's really teaching legal philosophy to little kids, which is this idea that Yertle is the king of the turtles, and he decides that he's dissatisfied with his life, even though he has everything he needs. So he's got the protections of liberty, he's got the blessings, but he wants more, and he doesn't seem to be satisfied with what he has. And so he arranges all of the other turtles to give him more. By doing this, he's laying down the seeds of his own destruction, and he can't see it. And if this seems to parallel a certain political figure at this time, he wouldn't be the first. And so many leaders of countries have fallen for this same kind of problem. And so you have to kind of think about this idea of what would justice, what would judges, what would law look like in the moment where the powerless are able to change their situation. And so Foucault identifies 3 elements that I think are absolutely critical. And it's interesting. He's describing the game. He's not saying how you win the game. And so the three elements are the third element, this thing that doesn't exist in this power versus powerless. There has to be some third thing there in order to negotiate. The second thing is you have to have some kind of an idea, shared universal understanding of what you think justice is, and an agreement among all individuals. And then you need some way of making decisions that you can enforce those decisions. And so really what he's responding to this question is saying exactly what we have is going to be what we'll have in the future. However, it would just be a different arrangement. So in other words, you can't change the periodic table of elements here on the planet Earth, but you can rearrange them. And that's kind of the main idea. So I just collected some images here that state the kind of the problem between the powerful and the powerless, at least since the Civil War. And the flag you see is a flag that was, the photograph was taken during the Civil War, allegedly, right? I have no way of proving that, but it says, that's what it says on the internet. I have no way of disproving it either. So the idea here is that at least since the Civil War, we've seen more groups of people have been, moving towards the powerful to say, I demand justice, I demand tranquility, I demand that I have some power in the structural relations. And so we want to think about it many people use the example of a chess game. I think you can think about it as chess, as a battlefield, but I'm more and more thinking about it in the terms of the International Space Station outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And so in other words, in a space that doesn't exist, it's just a very complicated thing I just said. But if you imagine like in a space that exists outside of our known reality, how would you reconfigure the relationships among people? And we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let's just think about it in the terms of a chessboard. And you want to think about it this way. If we describe the game of chess without ever mentioning the fact that the pawns exist and what their kind of main function is, which is to sacrifice their lives for the king and the queen and the bishops and the knights, then we're not really describing the game. So when you look at a common textbook that describes the United States government or describes the legal system, they never talk about the folks who are being sacrificed to keep this system going. And I've just shown you here that there's so many different people who are suffering injustice, and they all define it differently. And they're the pawns. They're not in positions of power. They aren't making any decisions, and they feel like they are, penned in or boxed in, and they're not able to get anywhere. They can only move one direction. That's what the pawns are. And so if you've ever seen The Wire, there's this interchange where the folks are playing checkers, and in checkers you can only move one direction. In chess, it's a three-dimensional space, and so you move in different directions based on your role. What power do you have based on your role? What actor are you in the chessboard? And so even though Bodhi has this idea that, well, all I have to do is be better at this game, I have to be a better pawn, the reality is, if you've ever seen the show, again, spoiler alert, Bodhi dies because he only moves one direction, whereas his opponents encircle him just like knights would, or bishops on a chessboard. And so he ends up dying because he doesn't understand his role within the structure. If he could have understood his role, he obviously would have had the choice to try to renegotiate and try to move in a different way. So we have to think about this, and I was thinking about this a lot based on the work that you've done this semester, and I've had a lot more data, right? A lot more students have completed assignments than do in the ordinary course of a semester. The bad side, right, is that there's a lot of evidence that many of you aren't fully understanding the material, which is not surprising. It would be the same thing if you're in a biology class or if you're trying to learn a new musical instrument. You're not going to master everything by yourself at home, most of you. So I wanted to try to get back at some of the parts you're having a hard time with. So I think you got to think about it this way, and I'm complicating this on purpose, but to kind of show you what's called the changeability, the flexibility, the malleability of rules. So if you thought of like rules as dough, since many of you are thinking about it as a thing, so let's compare it to a thing. Then it's like dough that you would make into bread or cake or a cupcake or a brownie or whatever. And so you can change it around based on what you want. And so you can do that, but up to a certain extent, right? If you've ever done this before, you pull it too much or you don't have the right mixture of elements, then it'll fall apart. That's kind of the thing of rules. So I'm going to call it the rule of rules. In other words, there's a rule that binds all the rules, no matter how you look at it. And so the question that you should think about, and this is individual to you, but also within your social group or the group that you identify with. And if you don't identify with a group as of yet, you're just like Alice in Alice in Wonderland, where she asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? Cat asks, well, where do you want to go? She says, I don't really care. That's how you are if you're saying, I'm not attached to a group. I'm not saying you're a pawn, but you're very likely going to be used, just like Alice is used, by people who do know what they want, who do know where they're going, who do know what group they're in, and they do know the rules of the game. And so you have to think about it, we're all differently situated. We all have different backgrounds. We have different strengths. We have different weaknesses. We're in different groups. How are we going to use the rules and to what end? And then I want us to think about also, then what are the rules? And then, what does a rule really mean? And again, the individual rules are going to be different, whether they're don't jaywalk, whether it's you have the right to defend yourself, right? There's different ways of thinking about it. But the rule of the rules is the same. In other words, we're all acknowledging and we're all using the concept of rules, even though we're using it very differently. So the structure is the same, and that's because we all live within or under the table within this structure of rules. So you want to think about what strategies are you going to use, and then who are your allies and who are your enemies. I know a lot of people don't like to think about the fact that they have enemies, especially unknown enemies. But an enemy in this sense, right, is that if everyone's competing for resources, then your enemy is someone who you are not working with. You're not cooperating with them. Your enemy is somebody who is discriminating against you, who's oppressing you, who's hates you. That would be a pretty clear idea of what an enemy is. Your allies, on the other hand, are folks who are your cheerleaders, the ones that are going to help you. Now, the strange thing is that, I'm going to throw out a number and we'll think about whether it's accurate. But if you had 100 people in a room, probably about 30 of them are going to be your allies, and about 30 of them are going to show themselves over time to be your enemies, which leaves the remainder of them, right? 40 of them, 60 of them you can see clearly. 40 of them you're going to not be sure. And these are the people who claim to be neutral. They're the people who think that they don't have to take a side, that they don't belong to a group. In my experience, these are the most dangerous people because they're going to make mistakes. And that's going to end up affecting you. So how do we educate that third group of people who are not sure how to function? Now, my idea is that they don't understand the rules of the game, and they don't understand that they're in a game. And so are they often used without their knowledge, and are they not quite sure that this is happening to them? Are they complying because that's the best decision to make in their situation? Is this a strategic decision? They might resist later. Or do they try to avoid the situation? Or do they resist in ways that we can't, see? So if we go back and we think a little bit, a contradiction is to speak against oneself, right? To be hypocritical, to not follow through with the idea that I have put forward. Whereas jurisdiction is to speak law, right? And so a law can't be a contradiction. In other words, if it contradicts itself, it's a contradiction. It's not jurisdiction. And so we want to see, where do we transition from a jurisdiction to a contradiction? How does this happen, right? Obviously, if I just write down a bunch of things, and let's say there's 10 of us, and we all agree on them, then that's clearly jurisdiction. Those are rules, those are laws we all agree, and we think they're universal, and they all apply to us. A contradiction would be then when, let's say, 2 people decide that they don't need to follow the rules, but the other 8 people are going to. And we call this injustice. We call this discrimination. We call this oppression, right? We call this abuse of power. But in really technical terms, this is a contradiction. We're speaking against what we've said. So I wanted to set up this kind of a graph here, or a table, where you can see the 3-dimensional board just like a chessboard. So the institution are the rules that we acknowledge exist and we decide to follow, to resist, or try to construct new ones. So if we think about Kingsborough, these are, GPA, grades, attendance, social behaviors, clothing, money, voice, activities on campus. I think it becomes very interesting now that your strategies or your instrumentalities have to change dramatically now that we're not on campus. We still have to follow all the same rules, but how we choose to follow them and how we choose to enforce them are very different than if we were on campus. So if you move over, it's knowledge of the rules, which is the big deal. If you don't understand how GPA works, you're obviously not going to make strategic decisions about how to increase your GPA. If you don't understand how attendance or how you dress is going to affect you in your final grade, then you're not going to make strategic decisions about what you decide to wear to go to school or how often you go. If you have more knowledge about your immediate economic situation, meaning that you need to make X amount of dollars by a certain day, you're going to make the strategic decision to follow that path and not necessarily the path in education. And so the idea is that some people are better at playing this game of education because they know how to play the game. Now, I was the first in my family to go to college. I went to community college. I think it's like many of you, at least according to the statistics, over 80% of the students that go to Kingsborough are the first ones to go to college. So we were immediately at a disadvantage when we walked onto the campus or when we registered for classes because we were having to learn the rules of the game as we went along. Folks with parents who went to college, and assuming that they talked to them, they provide valuable information about what the rules are long before the person ever starts the game of higher education. And so this is where we're differently abled from the very beginning. And if we then compare it to, say, colleges like Harvard or NYU or Columbia, or even less, privileged institutions like Hunter College or a college upstate, what we don't tend to talk to you about is that we are all competing with those folks in the common national marketplace. So if you want to be an FBI agent or an NYPD officer, you're not just competing with the folks that are in your class. You're competing with folks from these elite institutions as well. And if their parents went to school, they're going to be better at the game because they know the rules better. And this is why the haves come out ahead, as a famous saying goes. So then I kind of put it into 3 categories or 3 types of students based on what I've seen over 10 years. And this is what forms the mental model or the ideology. And so student X sees the college as a continuation of prison, like socialization from their K through 12 experience, where the rules are meant to be followed without question because otherwise there'll be consequences. Now this would be fine if where you wanted to go was into a factory, even into the military after you graduate from Kingsborough, because you don't need to think. You don't need to have a strategy. That's all being taken care of for you by your superior officers or by the corporate structure. It's telling you what to do. However, I'm not sure you needed to go to college to learn how to follow rules. And so it's not so much that you decided or had a strategy of going to college. It's that student X was thinking about, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm on this treadmill. I'm just going to keep walking. And so that's very much like that first character of Alice in Wonderland, is that she doesn't know where she's going. So student X is going to go somewhere, but there's not much strategy. And so there's kind of ignorant compliance or following the rules simply because they are rules and not really thinking about how the rules are going to affect you or how that they're being broken by other people who are going to get at a better position than you. Then you have student Y, who sees a menu of rules that she must choose from each with their own social group, language, culture, and norms. So this is kind of how I felt when I first got to college, as I saw, wow, there's so many different rules. There's so many different groups. I'm going to have to figure out which group I fit the best in, and I'm going to have to try out different things. And a large part of what we mean by liberal education is this idea. You take some science classes, some art classes, some writing classes, some reading classes, some science, political science classes, right? And you kind of see which group do you fit the best in? What are you doing the best at? And then you'll kind of continue on that path because you'll have a network of people who think like you and can help you. And then there's student Z, who sees the college as a subsystem of the larger social structure, which is the socioeconomic system. And they make strategic decisions to comply, avoid, resist, or construct rules with others. This is oftentimes students who end up in the honors program. They run for student office. They get into a student group. They work with other students to kind of see how to improve their situation while they're at Kingsborough, and then that obviously puts them further ahead when they transfer and they have more kind of skills to network with. And so if we kind of like, how does this then relate to institutions within the constitutional structure? So we move down and we say, well, look, the relationship between the community college is one of preparation for civil society, right? We're kind of socializing you to get ready to participate in democratic life. If we weren't in America, if we were in an authoritarian or totalitarian system, we would be preparing you for a very specific job. But in America, you have so many choices that you can make, even within a low-income group, right? There's still a lot of choices you can make. And so that's partially what the community college is doing. The second thing that it does is it's providing the acquisition of different knowledges from different disciplines. Like I said, from, let's say, biology, from literature, from history to sociology. Each of those has different packages of knowledge that you can kind of use in your everyday life. One thing I thought was pretty interesting when I was in college and I was taking, it was a statistics and algorithms class at community college, and we were using computers. And the teacher was teaching us about how airplanes use algorithms so they don't run into each other. But somehow, I think I was watching a lot of World Series of poker at that time, and I started to see, wait a second, there's a pattern here that also applies in games of poker. And so I started trying it out, and I ended up winning. And I thought, wow, math can get you paid. And so I think, this is true in a lot of different ways, especially the use of probabilities. Suddenly you have this access to information that you didn't have before, and that kind of improves your day-to-day life if you use it, right? And this is also the same thing about kind of structural relations. So what are your rights? And then what are the networks of people? That's agency. How do I work with other people? And then also practicing one's role in the institution. So if you simply see yourself as student and me as professor, you don't quite understand the chess game that we're playing at the institution. Certainly my role as professor gives me opportunities and choices that I can make, but I am more than that thing. I am not only a professor, just like you are not only a student. And so sometimes I push back in the classroom. Somebody calls me a professor, I call them student, right? This is just the role we're playing. This is not much else. It doesn't tell us much. It tells us what the distribution of power is, but we can change that distribution of power. We don't have to follow it. I don't have to yell at you and give you an F, for example. You don't have to always do every single assignment exactly the way I want you to do it. Sometimes you might, find a better way. So if we kind of think about it then, so what decisions would have to be made? Well, the colleges have to make a decision. Are they going to enforce a top-down approach, which they normally do, but then see that they're not doing it here? You have all these choices that you can suddenly make as far as what grade you want. Do you want a credit, no credit? Do you want to withdrawal? Do you want to wait and see what your grade is? All these different kind of choices you have, but it's still a top-down, right? They didn't ask students what they wanted to do. They didn't ask professors what they wanted to do. And so this is going to give the illusion that this is how society functions, that there's always going to be a group of people telling you what to do. That might be reassuring, right, to have your parents around bossing you around all the time. But but it's not realistic. There's going to be so many situations in life where you have to make your own decisions. And so if you haven't practiced that at the college, then you're certainly not going to be prepared, and you're going to have to learn as you do it. Just like I had to learn as the college, what the rules of college are as I'm going through it. And it's not that we can't do that, but it does put us further behind the folks that are better at it than us. And so we'll be constantly trying to catch up in a competitive system like the United States. And this is because the college does not have a concept for this type of student, that they are more likely to run into legal trouble. In other words, the college assumes that everyone is going to strategize and make the best possible decision. Now, I don't know why they make that assumption. If you just look at liberal arts students, for example, which is the largest quote-unquote major on campus, which of course isn't a major, when I talk to those students and I survey them and we look at data, I mean, almost all of them have no idea what they're doing. And that was the same thing for me. I was a liberal arts major because I had no idea what I was doing. If you're a nursing major, you're very clear on what you're going to do. If you're in the EMT program, you're very clear. At least if you're a criminal justice student, you have the idea that you're going to very likely transfer to John Jay, and at that place, you'll make the decision of kind of where your life is going to go. But you couldn't even possibly know all the decisions that you would need to make in order to secure a career from Kingsborough, right? We're just simply not providing you with enough information. You also want to think about it this way, then what's the mental model? Well, the prominent American mental model, the prominent American ideology that is often taught in schools is like self-reliance, right? You got to do everything on your own, and you got to do it even if you struggle. That's rugged individualism. You have to have a good work ethic, meaning just keep work harder, and that somehow this is going to result in the common good, so that if everybody works hard and is self-reliant, then there's going to be a common good. Well, this is insane. If you're only looking out for yourself, you have no idea of how to take care of anybody else. And if you look at parenting and marriage rates in this country, it's not shocking, right? We have a really hard time working together if that's how you've been socialized in this country. And so law is going to be a mystery, right? Because it's not going to make any sense that you have any say over how the rules are constructed. You're not practically good at working in groups. Students moan, and so did I, until I started to see the value of working in a group. And that's the hard thing, is that you can't see it unless you're doing it. And that's something we're not really, doing now, right? Something we would have done in the classroom, and it's much harder to do online, especially without any notice. Like, none of us had any notice that we're suddenly moving online. If we then kind of think about it this way, right? The structural problem, the chessboard is loaded with a very large number of people and a diverse body of students who come from, a bunch of different backgrounds, but mostly powerless, meaning you're less likely to vote, you're less likely to have contact with a government official, but you're also we're all coming from different cultures. And so, if you just look at Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island, 70% of the students are coming from first or second generation immigrants, meaning you're learning the rules of the game of higher education at the same time you're learning the rules of the game of New York City, at the same time you're learning the rules of the game of the national economic structure. And they're very likely to be different than the rules of the game where immigrants came from. And so you have this kind of clash of ideas and clash of choices, and it's very difficult without kind of a structure, without help, to kind of figure this system out. And so, if you have a different social norm, different language, and different economic outlook, then you're going to definitely have a different construct or a different idea of what law is. And so there's going to be a lot of different motivating factors. And so I kind of think about it this way, again, going back to student X is looking to get a job, and it's probably going to be reflective of family pressure. Student Y is going to want to learn more about the description of options. What are the specific majors? What are the specific transfer options? And this is going to be to basically get more economic stability through a career likely in the public sector, working for the government as opposed to starting your own business or working for a private kind of, banking system kind of job. And then student Z is really interested more in how to participate and activate their rights. They're loving the freedom of choice. They feel like they know the rules of the game, and now they want to use the rules to advance in society. So they're always seeking the best available options, and they're co-creating futures with other like-minded people. And this is really like if you look at Stanford or Harvard, this is like where those organizations come from. I know we romanticize and we believe that Zuckerberg, made the company all by himself, but he didn't. He did this with a lot of other people who were like him, and he did it in an environment where he could take those things and reorganize them and just use technology in a different way. I mean, he didn't really invent anything, right? And so you want to think about it that way. And then finally, you want to, let's be real. Given the prominent ideology, student X is most likely going to drop out because it's not going to match up, right? Community college does not provide jobs. And so there wouldn't be much of an incentive to keep, banging your head against the wall if you're getting C minuses or below. Why the student is because they're so busy trying to learn the rules of the game, they're not advancing, and so they're most likely to keep a C average, which means they might get an A or a B here and there, but most of their classes they're getting C's, and it's because just they haven't quite figured out the rules of the game. So the quicker they understand the rules and the quicker they have kind of stability in their personal life, the better they're going to do. And then Z is the most likely to graduate and expand options at the transfer college. And so this is the idea of like, well, how are we looking at groups then, right? So identity politics mirror the city political framework. So in other words, if I look at the power struggle in the city and I see ethnic neighborhoods fighting against ethnic neighborhoods for power, I'm not surprised I see the same thing at Kingsborough. If we change that dynamic and we start to see folks working together, then students would be less likely to see agency as a problem, as a difficulty. They'd be less cynical about what groups they belong to and about social change. And then, in other words, they'd stop looking at individualism and falling for that kind of myth, and they'd start working better within families and thinking about generational wealth. So the reason why this exists, right? Because that should be a big question, like why on earth, who invented this chessboard game? This was the negotiation of the Constitutional Convention, and this is what ends up being the Constitution. And that's why students are so confused at the beginning of a semester when I kind of have to correct many students about, I say, what is the Constitution? I hear the First Amendment. Like, what? No, that's the Bill of Rights, right? I mean, it says right there at the top, the heading, the Bill of Rights. My expectation, my assumption was that you had been, that had been explained to you before you got to POL 66 or POL 67. And so the fact that it hasn't been means that I have to back up and explain the rules of the game. And that's what I'm kind of explaining here. The Constitution is the framework or the design of the structure that we call government. And so this is really under a theory of the distribution of mass of power among its parts. Now, it's interesting that Madison uses the word mass here because this is a physics concept. So we're going to be borrowing knowledge that we gain from physics and the sciences to explain how people negotiate for power. And that's why it's called the science of politics or political science versus criminal justice, right? Criminal justice is about the crime and punishment system, which is why that's another class that you can take. You take corrections, policing, crime and punishment, intro to criminal justice. This is political science. This is the 66 and 67 are both legal. They're law classes. And so we're talking about the Constitution as kind of a chessboard or the rules of the game. And so this all kind of comes from this historical understanding from the Greeks, from the Romans, from the French and the English. And they kept studying like what holds groups of people together and then what causes them to fight with each other. And in each epoch, in each time, over 2,000 years, when power is concentrated with one group of people, they tend to abuse it. And they tend to use it against other people and force them into slavery, murder them, commit genocide, Holocaust, right? This is the big dilemma. So the big question then becomes, okay, so if power tends to come together, almost like gravity, right, pulls it together, how do we keep it apart? And the idea was pretty simple, right? The legislative, Congress, we should keep them in one part. The executive, the president, he should be over here. And then the Supreme Court and the court should be over here. And they really shouldn't have much to do with each other. The problem was that Madison said, the problem is that that's not real. Like, sure, that'd be great. Wouldn't it be great if the three of them could be separated and they never came together and conspired against people? But even today, there's just so much in the news where you have the president saying he wants the investigation into Russian interference in the election gone. And then you have the Justice Department saying it's gone. And then they say, well, I know that there was a crime committed here, but now Michael Flynn is going to be, we're not going to pursue the law in this case. And then you have Congress do nothing about it. And so you've got like this whole just very confusing situation of like, you separated the powers on paper, but in reality, look, they've come right back together again. And so lots of people call this the quote-unquote separation of powers, but Madison was talking about the blending of powers and the overlap. And so long as one group of people doesn't take that power, then it should be okay. Each group will kind of fight with each other. But, the problem here is that, kind of a common sense one that John Locke identified in the Scottish Enlightenment, and that formed like a lot of basis of the thinking in 1776, particularly the folks that were very worried that a federal or national government and that the Constitution would be a paper tiger, right? It wouldn't have any actual teeth. It wouldn't have any weight. And so he said, look, people give up their rights. Okay, so they give up equality, liberty, and their power over their own economic situation, the power to defend yourself, right? But only with the intention that it's going to like better preserve my health, my job security, my home. The only reason I would engage in kind of what's called the social contract is if it's going to be good for me. If it's bad for me, then clearly I wouldn't give up my rights. And so this was the concept of the Magna Carta, where you have a protection against arbitrary and capricious power, where the barons said, like, look, we're willing to negotiate with you, king. We're willing to negotiate with the powerful. But if it's not good for the powerless, the middle, and the powerful, then we're not going to negotiate. Let's just go back to war. Let's not have a cessation of hostilities. Let's not have peace. Let's go back to war. And so Madison's interpretation, which in the Greek is called exegesis, is that, the idea is that it just, if all three work together against the powerless in the middle, then you don't really have a free constitution. In other words, you've violated the basic principles. So the rule of rules has been violated. So just because there's rules, you've now gone into a situation where those rules are completely unfair and they're arbitrary. And so this whole concept is that you've like changed the rules of chess in the middle of the chess game. Now, this is not just all academic. This is not just all like interesting to think about. When this happens, as you see in the bottom picture, violence occurs. And so we go back to time and time again. When will the dictator of the proletariat happen in this country is the big question. If I go back to slide 1, it seems near. People are very angry. And they feel like the rules of the game have been violated. And so they're less likely to say that the rules or the rule of law is something they should follow. And this is what Barack Obama was saying recently, that if everyday people, if ordinary folks see that people can just break the rules and then nothing happens to them, what's going to stop them from breaking the rules? So I know we've had a struggle with the 3 dimensions of power, and so I want to put it in a larger perspective and get to the 4th dimension of power. So the complication arises when one group of people, in this case the rich and the elites, have control over the 3 departments, right? So they all go to the same schools, which I think you've seen in the news is, the rich people bribing colleges to let their kids in. They all work in the same handful of companies. They own stock in the same stocks. They all kind of go to the same places. It's one group of people has taken control of all 3 branches of government or all 3 departments of government. And what's worse is that they don't actually follow the rules themselves, which is just painfully evident over the last 10 years or so. And so this is what Montesquieu was really worried about. He said, look, the life of us, the subject, we're the subjects of this constitutional order, would be exposed to arbitrary control. In other words, we'd have no choices. We'd have no freedom. We'd have no liberty. And so before the deployment of federal powers, each government was constrained by the subject as neighbors. So in other words, when it was just local, before there was a federal government, if a rich man was trying to control me, I get 10 of my friends and we go talk to that man because he's right next door. but if I now am represented by someone who, was first living in Queens, then moves to Manhattan, then moves to DC, now moves to Florida, and I never get to see the person, I really don't have any influence over that rulemaker. So we go back to this idea is that power 1 is the domination over another person. Power 2 is the attempt of the domination using the structure, using the rules. So breaking the rules in order to move ahead. However, when this happens, historically what we see is groups aren't dumb. People aren't dumb. They say, wait a second, okay? If you're holding a gun to my head, there's nothing I can do, right? I'm sitting there and I'm just going to wait it out and see if I can survive, and then I'll fight another day. But if you just arbitrarily and suddenly change the rules and you decide you don't want to follow the rules, I'm not likely to follow the rules either. And so I'm going to start thinking about how can I, use this knowledge of the law, of the rules, to fight back, to resist. Then there's power 3, which is, a response, right? So as soon as I start to realize that this group is breaking the rules and using it against me, they realize, wow, we need to do something else. We've tried violence. We've tried changing the rules to benefit us. Now we're going to try one more thing. Let's control the economic base of relations. Let's manipulate the currency. Let's change interest rates. Let's make the price of college so unaffordable that only, the richest of the rich can go, right? So they make all these changes to the economic base. Let's, say $15 per hour is a good wage in America, which is insane, right? I mean, $30, $40 per hour is minimum to live in New York City. According to statistics, right? And people are making millions and millions of dollars. So this is completely unequitable when we start to think about the economics, about the job market. And now it's, blatantly obvious in this pandemic, and then now leading into this economic recession. So we need this third space, and that's what Foucault was talking about. There needs to be some third element that is going to allow for the powerful, the powerless, and the folks in the middle, the so-called neutral people, to talk this out and negotiate. And then power 4 would then be the successful completion of a stable system called equilibrium. And this would be like both something that's in our environment and also in our concept of knowledge in the way that we're using it. The idea here is to think, the ideal would be power 4, obviously, right? And this is more or less like what Einstein was working on in thinking about relativity. And so how do you have a stable system? And then unfortunately, right, you can deconstruct that to see what is an unstable system, which is what produces the atomic bomb. How do you control chaos? And that's going back to power 1, right? And so it's a circular logic, and trying to get out of this 3 dimensions of power into a 4th space where we can construct it is very difficult. But it is the ideal, it is the blueprint, it's the architecture, it's the design, and it is where we are at with physics knowledge. And so, maybe Madison was smarter than he realized when he used that reference to physics over 200 years ago. The harder part is, how do you get folks to recognize this 4th dimensional space and to recognize their own position within this space in a way that they're going to work with other people and co-construct knowledge. So the last 2 slides are going to talk about this a little bit. So in a recent book by a mentor of mine and a former professor from the University of Washington, Michael McCann and George Lovell, they looked at a really long study of looking at folks from the Philippines who have been engaged in labor union activism, pay equity, like getting paid the right wages, anti-racism, anti-violence work for over 100 years. And so you kind of see each generation making different types of progress and coming to different understandings and working with different groups of people. So their conclusion is that, look, hierarchies, right, the structure of like somebody's in control, Yertle the turtle kind of thing, I'm the king, I want it all, the middle, and then the low, always within issues of race, class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all the things that we've all identified as injustices, those are baked into the structural socioeconomic dynamics. In other words, that's the design. That was the constitutional framework. It was that negotiation among these different groups, powerless, powerful. And they called it an experiment because maybe we could work towards a more perfect union. But it's becoming evident that is not the case. In other words, you cannot expect anything to change in a structure that benefits the powerful. So this is my understanding. You can't expect radical change in the unequal distribution of role power, knowledge, educational equity, and economic equality until a majority of those without power, and I might say a majority of us without power, engage in strategies to use the law as a limit to the abuse of power over us. So in other words, we can't expect them, this is Dr. King said this, right? We can't expect them to give us our rights. We have to demand them. So we first have to realize what's happening to us. We have to realize that the game is rigged. And we have to realize then how to use the rules of the game to limit the folks who are breaking the rules. And that's a hard thing to do. And that's one reason why education is so important. So knowledge about the legal system is one way of becoming more aware of rights. But that so many of the powerless either do not understand the structural inequity that keeps them down, they don't understand that the rules are rigged against them, the intent of those who maintain power not to give up that power. In other words, I hear so many times that these terrible human beings who are murdering people, who are discriminatory, who are prejudiced, that they're ignorant, right? That they don't know what they're doing. This is just wrong. They very much know what they're doing, and they're designing the rules of the game to benefit themselves, and they're making choices to harm other people. And then the fact that people don't seem to understand that they don't have to simply obey, avoid, or passively wait, which again was going back to Dr. King. It was like, why we can't wait. This is evidence of the contradiction of law. This is the evidence, right? The fact that people don't understand, the fact that we haven't got to the fourth dimensional space of a social arrangement. This shows me, the researcher and the professor, that there's the huge gap between what we say law is as an ideal, what we'd like the world to be, and what law is as the real, as it's experienced by different people in different arrangements. And so that's not justice, right? That's not law. That's a contradiction. That's not jurisdiction. But this is not unique, right? Religion and politics also have suffered this same fate. And again, looking at it from a historical perspective for thousands of years. But each of these kind of things, religion, law, and politics, have embraced and engaged with this idea of nonviolence, saying that, well, look, nonviolence is better than violence. Well, on the other hand, violence has been the thing that has always changed the social order. And this is what folks call chaos. But chaos can be controlled. And so if you look at the killings of unarmed black men, or you look at lynchings of black men throughout history in America, that would be chaotic from the point of view of African Americans. It would look very controlled from the point of view of both white supremacists and folks who benefit from that power, who are not being victimized, who are not being targeted. And so nonviolence is not a natural thing. It's not something that exists in the natural world. Violence is everywhere. So the fact that these three institutions of religion, law, and politics have come to this concept of nonviolence is the ideal of law. It is this ideal that there could be a negotiation space. So when conflicts emerge, there has to be some agreement that there's going to be resolution towards peace, but that requires a cessation of hostilities. That's what peace is you can't be hostile anymore. You can't be aggressive. And you have to enter into a negotiation, and this has to include the powerless and the powerful and the neutral people, mostly who need to be educated about, there is no such thing as neutrality. You can't be neutral in a moving planet. And so I want to just end with someone who I think said it better than I could. In a book called Strive Towards Freedom, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explains it pretty clearly, I think. Violence is immoral. It's wrong. Right, because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It thrives on hatred rather than love. It leaves society in monologue, everybody just being as loud as they possibly can, saying what they believe, rather than dialogue, which requires that negotiation. And it requires that I have to put down my beliefs. I have to put down for a second my weapons and say, okay, I'm willing to understand you. And this concept ends by defeating itself. It's like a snake eating its own tail. And he sums it up this way. And this is the difference I want you to see, is there's the old law and there's the transformation of new law, and this is all part of the negotiation of human beings who construct what they believe the law is. And so the old law of an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind, and that seems to be where we're at now. So you want to think about that fourth space and the third space as this kind of, what kind of education is required for the powerless in order for us to overcome the abuse of power and those people from elite positions and rich positions that are breaking the rules every day.